In a quiet town, one veteran fought a war that never made the news. Elijah Stone, black, transgender, and a decorated soldier, returns home seeking peace. Instead, he finds a neighborhood full of whispered threats, broken flags, and secrets buried deeper than any battlefield. The morning air in Barrow Hill whispered like secrets between trees, the kind that carried echoes of old grudges and newer suspicions. It was the kind of town where the mailman knew who was late on their mortgage, where kids played beneath oak trees named after Confederate generals, and where change was met with polite silence or impolite stares. When Elijah Ward arrived on Elm Street, he knew the kind of stares he'd get. He had seen them in Vietnam when he was barely 20, again in Mississippi in the 80s, and once more when he stood in court in Atlanta to legally change his name, just 5 years prior. Elijah was a tall man, 62, with a military bearing that had softened only slightly with age. He moved like someone who had known violence too well and chosen peace instead. His skin was dark as the Mississippi Delta, his eyes the color of rusted brass. A salt and pepper beard framed his face, and a jagged scar ran down his left hand, a souvenir from a night in Hughes City he never spoke about. He drove a battered navy blue truck up the quiet curve of Elm Street, pulling into the driveway of a small white house at the corner. The house had been empty since Mrs. Langley passed the previous winter. Elijah bought it in cash, quietly, through an out-of-town agency. As he stepped out, the silence thickened. Curtains twitched. Dogs barked from behind fences. He felt the weight of history in every crack of the sidewalk. It didn't take long before the introductions began. Barbara Clark, a wiry woman in her late 50s, with an eternal sun hat and sharper eyes than she let on, arrived with a smile stretched too tight. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said, holding a lemon-pound cake wrapped in cellophane. "We don't get many newcomers on this street." "Thank you," Elijah said, accepting the cake and offering a firm handshake. She took it briefly. "You retired?" she asked, nodding toward the Marine Corps decal faded on his truck. "Yes, ma'am. 24 years of service." "And now you're settling in here," she said, the words bending slightly at the end, like they didn't quite believe themselves. "I am," he said. "Quiet life, trees, good air. Seemed like the right place." Barbara hesitated, then smiled again. "Well, we're a tight-knit community. You'll get used to us." But tight-knit in Barrow Hill had another meaning. It meant Friday night church socials where outsiders weren't invited. It meant whispered gossip before the sermon. And it meant that by Monday morning, half the neighborhood knew something was off about the new man on the corner. It wasn't Elijah's race. Not exactly. They had a few black families in town, mostly long-timers, folks they'd grown used to and made room for in their own peculiar way. No, what it was, and what they hadn't confirmed yet, but were already suspecting, was deeper, more taboo in their minds. Whispers started when Barbara, after her second glass of boxed wine that Sunday, mentioned something about Elijah not being on the deed from 10 years back when that name was Elaine. Someone remembered seeing something online, a photo, a name that didn't match. And just like that, Elm Street began to change. The first sign was subtle. His trash cans were knocked over one morning. Then someone threw eggs at his truck. A dog left something on his porch. Always in the night, always silent. Elijah, who had survived ambushes in jungles, who had fought his own body and mind for decades, who had rebuilt himself piece by piece, stood on his porch and looked out over the street he had tried to call home. He said nothing, just sipped his coffee and watched. But he kept a journal. Every noise in the night, every voice that went quiet when he passed, every strange thing he found on his lawn. And he waited. Because Elijah Ward knew something that Elm Street didn't. He hadn't come to this town just for peace. He had come back. 3 weeks after Elijah's arrival, the rhythm of Elm Street had changed. The mail came slower. Children no longer rode their bikes past his driveway. The air, once humming with neighborly pleasantries, turned thick with unspoken tension. Elijah knew the sound of surveillance. The barely closed blinds, the occasional parked truck with someone, just waiting for someone. The way conversations hushed when he walked by. He had learned long ago that sometimes survival was about listening more than speaking. He didn't react. Not when someone keyed the side of his truck. Not when the welcome mat was set on fire one evening. Not even when someone spray painted the word freak on his fence in red letters. Instead, he rebuilt the mat, repainted the fence, cleaned the truck. Then he put up a security system. Covert, smart, and silent. But it was the letter that shook him. Folded into his mailbox, no return address, just a single sheet of paper, typed in courier font like it had been spat out of an old typewriter. Elaine, you don't belong here. People talk. You should leave before something worse happens. We remember. He read it 3 times. Then he folded it, placed it into a manila envelope marked 1, and filed it into a locked cabinet beneath his bed. That night, he pulled an old shoebox from his closet, one of the few things he'd carried with him for decades. Inside, dog tags, faded photographs, and court documents. On top was an old Polaroid, a photo of 3 young Marines standing in front of a burning building in Da Nang, grinning, bloody, alive. Elijah, then still Elaine, stood on the right, holding a wounded soldier upright. The man in the middle had his arm slung around her neck, sweat and dirt on his brow, but smiling through it. Matthew Cray. And Elijah hadn't heard that name in nearly 30 years, until last week. He'd caught it during a town hall meeting. The mayor had praised the long service of Deputy Cray, a man who'd returned to Barrow Hill in the late 90s and kept our town safe ever since. Elijah had frozen, pen in hand, as he stared at the man with grizzled blonde hair and eyes like chipped ice. Cray hadn't looked his way. Not yet. But Elijah knew those eyes, and Cray would recognize him, eventually. Cray, the man who once called Elijah sister, even after he'd come out. Cray, who stood by him during training, but not after discharge. Cray, who vanished after the court-martial inquiry where a young trans Marine testified against a commanding officer for sexual assault, and was met with betrayal instead of justice. Elijah remembered everything, and from the way the letter was worded, from the specific language, we remember. It wasn't just a warning, it was a memory, a buried one, dug up with intent. That night, Elijah walked out onto his porch and sat beneath the halo of his porch light. He lit a cigar, let the smoke curl upward into the dark, and whispered to the silence, "I didn't come here to run. I came here to bury ghosts, but ghosts have a way of digging themselves out." Across the street, a curtain twitched in Barbara Clark's window. Behind her, her son James, a high school dropout and self-proclaimed watchdog of the neighborhood, muttered something under his breath about getting rid of the sickos. But what neither Barbara nor James knew, what even Elijah hadn't planned on, was that there was another veteran in town, someone who also remembered Da Nang, someone who had their own scores to settle. And unlike Elijah, they hadn't come to heal. They'd come to destroy. The storm rolled in just past midnight, not the kind with thunder and rain, but the kind that settled deep in the bones. A quiet, barometric pressure that told Elijah Ward something was coming. He had spent the evening going over old service records. He didn't need to. He knew every page by heart. The dishonorable discharge that became honorable after a review. The medical forms. The testimonies redacted beyond meaning. But he looked anyway. A ritual. A reminder. In the dim light of his study, he ran a calloused finger across a name on one of the old manifests. Staff Sergeant Leon Mercer. The name hit like a shell impact. Leon was more shadow than man back in Nam. Special Forces, one of those black ops boys who moved through fire like it was fog. Elijah had only crossed paths with him once, during an extraction gone sideways in Quang Tri. Leon had slit a man's throat, winked, and disappeared into the trees like a myth. Years later, there were whispers. Mercer had gone rogue, joined mercenary outfits in Africa and South America. Untraceable, untouchable. And now Elijah had seen the impossible. 2 days earlier, outside of Barrow Hill's hardware store, he'd passed a tall man in dark denim and a weathered leather jacket. The man hadn't looked at him, but Elijah had recognized the gait, the bearing, exact, military, like a knife ready to unsheath. There had been a scar under his left eye, Mercer's signature, and later that night, a dead raccoon was nailed to Elijah's front door. Its throat slit the same way Mercer had once demonstrated on a Viet Cong prisoner. Efficient, surgical, symbolic. That was the first real message. Elijah buried the animal quietly and scrubbed the blood with bleach and boiling water. Then he sat on his porch, hands trembling. Not from fear, but from memory. Because Leon Mercer didn't show up in a town unless he had a reason. And Elijah knew two things about Mercer. He only returned for war or for revenge. The following morning, Elijah received a second letter. No envelope. Just taped to his truck window in broad daylight. Typed again. Same courier font. Some debts don't die. You know what you did. Time to finish it. Below the words was a map, hand-drawn, the backwoods outside Barrow Hill near the old mill, the place where everything went wrong in 1983. That year, Elijah, still Elaine then, had returned stateside to testify against Captain Martin Feld, a decorated Marine accused of raping two lower-ranked service members, including Elijah. The trial had been a circus. Intimidation, evidence mysteriously vanishing, testimonies retracted. One of the victims disappeared, and then Mercer had shown up, quietly, with a solution. There's no justice for people like you, Ward, he'd said, but there's a reckoning. They'd driven Feld into the Georgia backwoods. It was supposed to be a scare, a confrontation, nothing more. But Feld died. A gunshot to the head, no fingerprints, no bullet ever recovered. Officially ruled a missing person. Unofficially, buried under 10 feet of clay in the woods by the mill. And Mercer had vanished. Elijah had told himself it was self-defense, that Feld had reached for a weapon, that Leon had made the call. But there were things about that night he never fully remembered. Blackout patches in the brain, like someone had edited out keyframes of film. Now the past was unspooling, and Elijah knew Mercer wanted something. Maybe vengeance, maybe silence, maybe one last blood payment. But that wasn't the only fire burning in Barrow Hill, because Deputy Matthew Cray had started doing some digging of his own. In the sheriff's office, Cray sat alone after hours, a flask half empty beside him, the blue computer glow casting long shadows. He was staring at an old personnel file, one he thought had been purged. Elaine Ward, medical leave, gender dysphoria diagnosis, complaint against commanding officer, dismissed. Then a file attached, unmarked, sealed under a federal ID. He clicked it open, static at first, then a voice. This testimony is submitted under sealed order as part of a military tribunal concerning Captain Martin Feld. The voice was Elijah's, clear, strong, and suddenly Cray remembered. The courtroom, the shouting, the embarrassment, the betrayal, how he'd refused to speak in Elijah's defense even after all they'd been through in country. Cray's lip curled. This son of a bitch came back to haunt us, he muttered. Well, not again. Not here. He reached for his phone, dialed Barbara Clark. Tell your boy James, he said. It's time to remind our guests that some sins don't get forgiven. But what Cray didn't know, what even Mercer might not have known, was that Elijah wasn't alone. There was someone else in Barrow Hill, a young woman, black, 27, new to town, working at the public library. Name, Nia Ward, Elijah's daughter, and she had her own secrets. The Barrow Hill Public Library sat on the edge of town like a forgotten relic. An old brick building, moss creeping up its sides, stained glass windows holding tight to the dust of centuries. It was the kind of place few visited unless they had to. But inside, beneath the hush of aging ceiling fans and the scent of yellowed pages, Nia Ward worked the front desk like she'd always belonged there. To the town, she was just that new girl, quiet, polite, bookish. Some said she came from Atlanta. Others guessed Baltimore. No one asked too many questions. No one guessed she was Elijah Ward's daughter. She kept it that way on purpose. Each morning she wore the same neutral smile. She shelved books, ran the children's reading hour, helped retirees with email logins. But behind the facade, she had one goal: protect her father. Nia had grown up knowing Elijah's truths before she could spell Vietnam. She knew his body carried wounds that never made it to the x-rays. She knew about the dark years, the military hearings, the threats, the nights he drank too much and apologized too little. But she also knew what they did to him, what they tried to do. And she had sworn, ever since she was 16, that she would never let them finish what they started. That promise had brought her to Barrow Hill under a false name. Her official ID read Nia Williams. She'd applied for the library job the week after Elijah bought the house, found an apartment 2 towns over, and drove in every day like it was coincidence. But this wasn't coincidence. This was surveillance. She first noticed something wrong when she was archiving local newspaper reels from the 1980s. It was part of a digitization project she had suggested, half as a cover and half out of real interest. She wanted to learn who had power in this town and who had kept it. That's when she found the obituary. Captain Martin Feld, presumed missing, 1983. Last seen near Barrow Hill. Investigation ongoing. There was no mention of the military inquiry, no mention of the rape allegations. Just vague lines about mental health issues and unresolved trauma. The kicker? The article was sponsored by a private donor, Leon Mercer. Nia blinked. She'd heard the name before. Her father had mumbled it once during a nightmare. She'd written it down in her journal. But now it was real. On paper. Funded. Scrubbed. She scanned the article, cross-referenced names, and there it was, buried deep in the town's donation records. Deputy Matthew Cray, former Army intelligence, transferred to Barrow Hill in 1998, so the players were all here. Mercer, Cray. And now someone was dragging her father back into a game he never asked to play again. And worse, something was building. The town was buzzing more than usual. That day, Barbara Clark came into the library. Nia watched from the checkout desk as she accidentally knocked over a display of banned books and refused to apologize. She didn't know Nia's name, but she looked at her a beat too long. Then she muttered, "Some people just don't belong here. Doesn't matter how quiet they are." Later that night, Nia followed a hunch and tapped into the local sheriff department's digital bulletin board. It wasn't hard. Small town systems were paper-thin in cybersecurity. She found a memo sent to patrol officers. Increased watch requested for Elm Street residents. Ward. Recent reports of erratic behavior. Possible connections to cold case. Proceed with caution. The date? Yesterday. The author? Deputy Cray. They were building a case. One slow, careful lie at a time, and then the final twist. As Nia pulled away from the sheriff's intranet, an email pinged her burner account, one she hadn't used since college. It was encrypted, military grade. Subject line, "We all owe something." Sender, unknown. Message body, "He's meeting you at the old mill." You were never supposed to know, but you do. So come. Attached was a photo, grainy black and white. A man in a military jacket, standing beside Elijah in the jungle. And beside them, half in shadow unmistakably, Nia. Except the photo was dated 1983, 5 years before she was born. That night, Nia drove to her father's house, headlights off, crawling slow. Elijah was already outside, sitting on the porch with a shotgun across his lap, and a look in his eyes she hadn't seen in years. She sat beside him without a word. After a while, he said, "He's alive." "Mercer, you saw him, didn't you?" "I did, but there's more. Cray's in on it. They're trying to pin it all on you. And Dad." She hesitated. "There's something else. Something weird. I think they've been watching us for longer than we thought, before we even got here." He looked at her then, really looked. "What do you mean?" She showed him the photo. He held it like it was a wound. His hands shook. This isn't possible." "I know," she said softly, "but maybe the truth isn't what we thought it was." The woods behind Elm Street weren't just thick with trees. They were thick with silence. The kind that devours sound, that makes footsteps vanish and breath feel like betrayal. Elijah had always hated forests since the war. Too many memories hiding in branches. Too many men who never came back out. Tonight, though, he was walking in. Nia stayed behind in the house. She wanted to go with him, fought him on it. But Elijah insisted. "If I don't come back," he'd said, "you take what we know and burn this town to the ground." She hadn't cried, but her eyes had that shine he'd seen once in a mirror just before a medevac left him behind. Now he was alone. He moved carefully, the shotgun strapped to his back, a flashlight in one hand, and a service knife tucked in his boot. The map Mercer had sent him, the one with the marked location near the old mill, was folded in his jacket pocket, soaked slightly from sweat and humidity. It took him an hour to reach it. The mill was a rusting carcass of iron and rot, the remnants of some failed lumber operation from the 1950s. The wood was splintered and hollow, its frame bowing like tired shoulders. Ivy crept through every crack like veins on a corpse, and in the middle of the clearing, a man, tall, military straight. A leather coat stretched tight over his broad frame, and a familiar scar cut across his cheek like an old threat. Leon Mercer. "You came," Mercer said, his voice hoarse, almost gravel. "You called," Elijah replied. "You always did like the theatrics." Mercer smiled, but it was the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "You remember what happened here?" Elijah stiffened. "I remember you killed Feld, buried him, told me to forget." "No," Mercer said, stepping forward. "I didn't kill him." Elijah frowned. "I saw you, gun in hand. You saw what you needed to. We both did." Mercer reached into his coat slowly. Elijah tensed, but he only pulled out a flash drive, held it out. "Take it." Elijah hesitated, then took it. "That contains footage. Feld had a body cam that night. CIA issued. They were tracking him. He wasn't just a predator. He was an asset. Protected. Groomed. We were never supposed to win in that trial." Elijah felt the world tilt. "What?" Mercer nodded. "You weren't just testifying against a rapist. You were exposing a cover-up. They couldn't kill you back then, so they discredited you, buried the trial, made you look unstable. That's why Cray turned on you. He was pulled in, promised promotion if he shut you down." Elijah's mouth was dry. "Why now? Why bring this up?" Mercer looked around the trees. "Because something's coming, and this town is ground zero." Just then a sound cracked through the trees. A rifle shot. Elijah dropped instinctively. Mercer rolled behind a log. Another shot hit a branch inches from Elijah's head. They were under fire. More footsteps. Multiple. "Ambush," Mercer growled. "Cray's men, move!" They scrambled into the trees, weaving between trunks, ducking gunfire. Mercer led Elijah down a gully, into a tunnel beneath the mill's foundation. It was cramped and dark, but it held. For now. They waited in the quiet, breathless. "They're going to kill both of us," Mercer said, "unless we expose the truth first." Elijah clenched his jaw. "Then we expose it." But back in town, things were already unraveling. Nia heard the gunshots from her porch. She grabbed her backpack, already packed with flash drives, maps, and her father's old military files, and got into her car. But as she turned the key, she saw it. A figure across the street, James Clark, Barbara's son, holding a hunting rifle. He waved, then mouthed, "We're watching." Nia reversed hard, tires squealing. She had one destination in mind, the town's only broadcast tower, old, nearly forgotten, but still functional. She was done playing quiet. If they wanted to hide the truth in the trees, she would burn the whole forest down with it. The broadcast tower on Ridgeview Hill hadn't been used for public messages in years. Once part of Barrow Hill's emergency alert system, it had been quietly retired after a regional upgrade. A relic from a time when the government still feared Soviet missiles more than internal rot. But Nia had done her research. A few old access codes, a map of the server room, and one stolen key card from a lazy intern at City Hall had given her everything she needed. She parked the car at the base of the hill, engine still running. Her backpack thudded as she slung it over one shoulder. In her chest, her heart was a fist punching her ribs. Inside the tower, cobwebs greeted her. Rust clung to the metal rails like mold. She flicked on her headlamp and climbed 3 floors up to the control hub, where an ancient console blinked softly like it had been waiting. She slid the flash drive into the port, the one Mercer had given her father. The footage was brutal. Grainy night vision. A handheld view swaying as it followed Captain Feld, drunk, arrogant, laughing through a camp, his voice a slur. "I own these kids. They think I'm God." Then Elaine, Elijah, younger, standing firm, speaking clearly. You're going to answer for what you did. Feld swung. There was a struggle. Mercer emerged from the shadows. And then the video went black. Cut off. Redacted. But what mattered had been said. There was another file. One Nia hadn't seen before. Text only. Operation Sand Veil. Her fingers hovered as she opened it. Lines of classified memos. Names, Cray's included, Mercer's. Even the judge from the tribunal. All marked black wire clearance only. Complicity noted. And one final directive, dated 1983. Subject, Elaine Ward. Priority, suppress. Nia felt the bile rise in her throat. Her father hadn't been collateral. He'd been a target. She prepped the broadcast. Video first, documents after. She linked it to her live stream backup, rerouted the tower feed through 4 VPNs. Then she paused. Once she hit enter, there'd be no going back. No safe house, no invisibility. Just truth and fire. Her hand hovered. Then she whispered, "For you, Dad." She pressed the key. The tower blinked to life. Static buzzed, then the screen rolled into the footage. Across Barrow Hill, on every working TV, every open computer tab, every emergency alert system still patched to the tower, the broadcast played. At the sheriff's station, Deputy Cray dropped his coffee when the footage began. The staff around him turned silent, eyes wide. He lunged for the power button, but it was too late. Phones began ringing. One of his deputies muttered, "Jesus Christ, is that you?" Cray's hands shook. He ran for his cruiser. Back at the mill, Mercer and Elijah heard the tower's hum, the buzz of truth cutting through the static of lies. Mercer looked at Elijah and nodded. "Your girl did it." Elijah allowed himself one small breath of relief. Then gunfire shattered the air again. They were surrounded. Nia barely made it to her car before headlights lit up behind her. A black SUV screeched to a halt, tires spitting gravel. James Clark stepped out, rifle in hand. "You think you're clever, huh?" he growled. Nia didn't answer. She had her father's shotgun in the trunk, but she didn't move for it. Not yet. "What you did, it's gonna ruin everything. People like you don't get to win." Nia looked at him with calm fury. "Number people like you just got used to us staying quiet." He raised the rifle. Her heart stuttered. But then, a voice from behind James. "Put it down." Barbara Clark, her face pale, eyes wide. No gun, no courage. "Put it down, Jimmy," she repeated, more pleading than firm. James hesitated, just for a second. Long enough. Nia ducked, popped the trunk, and came up armed. "Drop it," she said. "I won't ask twice." James froze. The moment stretched. Then, he lowered the rifle. At the same moment, Cray reached the edge of the mill, gun drawn, vengeance burning in his chest. But he wasn't alone. Mercer stepped out of the woods behind him, silent as a ghost. "You were supposed to kill him," Cray snarled. "I never worked for you," Mercer said flatly. And then Elijah stepped forward, weapon aimed, but not firing. Cray raised his hands, but there was madness in his eyes. "You think this matters?" he spat. "You think anyone gives a damn what you did 40 years ago?" Elijah's voice was low, steady. "They do now." From the trees, red and blue lights lit the clearing. Someone had called the state police. They were too late to stop what happened decades ago, but not too late to see who tried to bury it. By sunrise, the story had spread beyond Barrow Hill. Whistleblower reveals cold case cover-up in small Georgia town. Decades-old military scandal brought to light. Trans veteran vindicated in explosive leak. Elijah stood on his porch as reporters began to arrive. Beside him, Nia. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. And across town, as Cray was led into a cruiser and Barbara Clark shut her door for good, the trees rustled. Watching, waiting. Because the truth doesn't die in the forest. It grows roots. The morning after the broadcast, Barrow Hill wasn't the same. The usual calm of the town had broken like a mirror dropped in silence. Shards of truth scattered across every porch, coffee shop, and church pew. People who had smiled in polite denial for decades now spoke in hushed tones, avoiding eye contact with their neighbors. Some were angry, some afraid, A few were brave enough to admit they'd always suspected something was off, but no one could pretend anymore. And for Elijah Ward, that meant something he hadn't felt in a long time: vindication. He stood at his kitchen window, staring at the road. No patrol cars, no pickup trucks with their lights off, waiting. No Barbara Clark peering through her blinds with a phone in hand. Just sunlight and silence. He turned from the window and sat down across from Nia. She was still in her hoodie, dark circles under her eyes. Her laptop was open on the table, emails flooding in. Whistleblowers, journalists, veterans, survivors. Some messages were angry, calling her a liar, a fraud. But most were grateful. Some were shaking. Some were ready to talk. "You started something," Elijah said quietly. She looked at him. "We did." He nodded. But there was still more to come. That afternoon, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation descended on Barrow Hill like a second storm. The sheriff's department was suspended pending investigation. Cray refused to speak without a lawyer. The footage Nia had released became the centerpiece of a formal inquiry. Operation Sandvale no longer a rumor, but a lead. Elijah gave his first official statement in 40 years. He stood at a podium outside the courthouse, hands folded, voice clear. "I was silenced because I told the truth, because I refused to let someone in power hurt others and walk away." He paused, looked out at the crowd, some supporters, some still doubting. "I served this country, and when I came home, I was told my story didn't fit the uniform I wore, that my identity was inconvenient, that my truth would be buried. But the dead don't stay quiet, and the truth doesn't rot." A quiet settled over the crowd, and then someone clapped, then another, then more. It wasn't a parade. It wasn't redemption in gold letters, but it was real. That night, Nia received an anonymous email, no subject line. Inside, a video attachment. She clicked it and froze. The camera was shaky, shot at night. Someone walking through the woods, breathing hard. Then the view panned to a clearing. A group of men, uniformed but unmarked, stood around a burning pile of folders, black bags, and something else. Something shaped like a body. A voice whispered off camera, "They're cleaning house." Phase 2 begins soon. You've cracked it open, but it goes deeper than this. At the end of the video, a flash of a face, Leon Mercer, but this time bloodied, held at gunpoint, whispering, "Not me, him, look higher." Then darkness. Nia didn't sleep. She went outside where her father sat on the porch with 2 mugs of tea. He handed her one. "They're still coming," she said. "This wasn't the end." "I know. What do we do?" He looked out at the road again, at the trees that once watched him with malice. "We stop surviving," he said. "We start fighting." Nia nodded slowly, but in her chest something twisted, because the email hadn't come from a whistleblower. It had come from her mother's old account. Elaine Ward, officially declared dead in 1997 after a car accident. But now Nia wasn't so sure. At dawn, she stood over the ashes of the old Clark greenhouse. It had burned down in the night. Arson suspected, no one injured, but spray painted on the side of the remaining foundation, in red. One lie down, 1,000 more to go. Elijah joined her minutes later, staring at the wreckage, his jaw tight. "They think this will scare us." "No," Nia said. "They're trying to distract us." She handed him the video, the final shot of Mercer, the whispered phrase, "Look higher." Elijah stared for a long time, and then he said something she'd never heard him say before. "We need to go back to D.C. Nia blinked. "What?" "That's where this started. The trial, the names, the men pulling the strings." She frowned. "You're saying this goes beyond Cray? Beyond Mercer?" "I'm saying Mercer wasn't the architect." Elijah looked at the sky, clouds gathering in the east. He was just the first floor. They arrived in D.C. under a sky that threatened rain. The capital was always built to impress, but for Elijah and Nia, the marble monuments and glass towers felt less like symbols of democracy and more like walls built to keep certain people silent. They stayed in a motel in Arlington near a metro line. Low profile, cash only. Nia brought the flash drives, the laptop, and the encrypted copy of the video showing Mercer bloodied and whispering, "Look higher." Elijah brought only his notebook and his memory. The next morning, they met someone who had been waiting for them, Althea Knox. She was tall, soft-spoken, mid-60s, with silver dreadlocks pulled into a tight bun. She introduced herself as an archivist, but her badge, flashed discreetly, marked her as internal oversight from the Department of Veterans Affairs. "I've been following your story," she said as they sat in a quiet corner of a public library. "You're not the first to try, but you're the first to get this far alive." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "You know about Operation Sand Veil?" Knox gave a thin smile. "I know it was never just about one predator. Sand Veil was a stress test, a program to see how far a military structure could bend ethics in the name of loyalty." Nia leaned in. "Who started it?" Knox slid a folder across the table. "General William Hart." Elijah's breath caught. Hart had been the decorated face of the military tribunal that dismissed his case. He'd shaken Elijah's hand once, had told him he was a model soldier. "He was CIA before he was military," Knox continued, "part of a joint operation to test psychological compliance in combat zones. The cover was Reorienting Behavioral Deviance Among Special Units. Translation: if you were queer, if you were trans, if you didn't fit the mold, you were either weaponized or buried." Nia stared in disbelief. "And no one stopped him?" Knox's eyes darkened. "They tried. Most of them are either dead, discredited, or disappeared." She passed a second file. Inside, a list of sealed documents. One stuck out. "Project Architect, Directive Omega." "That's your real enemy," Knox said. "Sandvale was a curtain. Architect built the stage." That night, Elijah sat alone in the motel. He stared at the file, thought about his squad. Elaine, Feld Mercer, the long line of people who were pieces in something none of them could see while they were bleeding on the ground. Then his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered. A voice. Familiar. Weak. "Elijah." He froze. "Mercer?" A ragged breath. "They're killing them." "Knox is next. They know you're in D.C. Where are you?" "I don't know. Underground. Concrete everywhere. Smells like bleach and death. But I found something." The sound of shuffling. A scrape. "Architect isn't a program. It's a person." "What?" "General Hart's dead. But the real architect, he stayed in the shadows, switched agencies, disappeared into the intelligence community. Name's..." A thud, a gasp. "Mercer?" A second of static. Then another voice. "Stop digging, Sergeant." Then silence. The next day, Nia hacked into the VA's old digital archive with Knox's access credentials. Deep in a forgotten database, buried beneath layers of redactions, she found it. Architect identity, Richard Stokes, former NSA, now senior advisor to Homeland Security. And in his photo, aged, cold-eyed, Elijah recognized the man from the back row of his trial, the one who never spoke. "I thought he was a clerk," he muttered. Nia shook her head. "He was your executioner." They knew what came next. This wasn't a battle to win in court. Not yet. The system wasn't ready to police itself. So Elijah and Nia went public again, this time with Knox's help. They released everything. Project Architect, the files, the evidence, Mercer's bloodied video. They named names and dared the country to blink. Within hours, it went global. Veterans from multiple countries stepped forward. Former intelligence agents, retired and otherwise, sent anonymous confirmations. The pressure cooker boiled. Congress demanded hearings. Stokes disappeared. And in the ashes of cover-ups and whispered threats, something unexpected happened. A movement formed, not just for Elijah or for Nia, but for every person chewed up by systems that labeled them wrong, then buried them in silence. 6 months later, Barrow Hill had changed. The Clark House was boarded up. Cray was awaiting trial. A statue of Confederate heritage in the center of town was replaced with a plaque commemorating whistleblowers. Elijah returned home to a porch rebuilt by volunteers, a flag that flew for truth, not silence. And Nia? She stayed. started a nonprofit for veteran survivors and LGBTQ plus soldiers, called it Project Root. Their motto, truth grows in the open.